planning to spend a bunch of money in the offseason, and there would be salary cap constraints anyway. I'm just curious.
We're going to spend all the money we have in offseason.
Well, that gets to the question that with new ownership, with the Adelson and Dumont families, what's your sense of their commitment to spending what would be necessary on the player salary front to go where the franchise wants to go?
Yeah, I don't think money's going to be an object. I think it's doing it the right way, bringing in people with good character. The money is not going to be the limiting factor. They want to win. We're going to be smart about it, though. But I don't expect we're not having money conversations.
Can the Mavericks pull off this trade when it comes to Tim Hardaway Jr. or this one for Jerami Grant from the Portland Trailblazers, or any other wild trade scenarios that have come up in Mavericks news today? This is Inside the Mavs. Welcome to Inside the Mavs, presented by Aura. I'm your host, Kevin Gray, Mavericks Pre and Post Game host on the Dallas Mavericks Radio Network. Appreciate you joining us here for this episode of Inside the Mavs. Make sure you download and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast for free. Give it a 5-star rating and write a review for it while you're there. And if you're watching this on my YouTube channel at Kevin Gray Sports, make sure you like and comment on the video as well, and subscribe to Kevin Gray Sports, and follow me on Twitter at the same. Joining me here from 105.3 The Fan, host of The Get Right and basketball fan analyst. You can catch him on Locked On Mavs, hanging out with my buddy Nick Angstadt, talking all things Mavericks basketball as well. My guy Reginald Adetula joining me here on Inside the Mavs. Reg, what's going on?
If you're watching this on YouTube and you see my eyes dart away from the general apparatus of the screen frequently, just know I have a fear of missing out, and apparently Woj going off tonight. He putting up numbers, so that's what I'm doing. Just want you to know that.
Yeah, Woj going for like 60, 20, and 25 tonight, based on when we're recording this here on Tuesday evening, because I plan on doing this a little bit earlier, but then Woj decided to entirely drop bombs, as he's occasioned to do from time to time. Of course, if you're watching this, the big trade that's happened, of course, Mikal Bridges getting sent to the New York Knicks for what was 5 first-round picks from the Nets to the Knicks does go Mikal Bridges.
Danny Ainge will pay for his crimes.
Will he, though, or is he just set a new trend for the NBA? But that's the big news as we are recording this. But a lot of Mavericks news dropping today as well. Shout out to Mark Stein of Substack, longtime NBA insider, and Jake Fisher of Yahoo Sports, who detailing some things with respect to Tim Hardaway Jr. And in today's show, we're going to dive into some of the news with respect to Tim Hardaway, Mavericks front office move that was also made by the Detroit Pistons, and what a particular trade scenario was come up with by Bleacher Report, Reggie's favorite publication when it comes to these kinds of things. But at the same time, let's start here. Tim Hardaway Jr., who's got what is a $16.2 million expiring contract. According to Mark Stein, the Detroit Pistons have emerged as a potential trade partner with the Mavericks when it comes to Tim Hardaway. Mark Stein saying that a little bit earlier on Tuesday afternoon. And it's interesting because this is not something that's not come up before when it comes to Tim Hardaway. The Pistons have been kind of one of the teams that he's been rumored to go to now for, it feels like, forever at this point. But Mark Stein putting that officially out there today, as, again, we're recording this on Tuesday, saying that Detroit has emerged as a potential trade destination for Dallas' Tim Hardaway Jr. A full potential trade construction has not yet emerged, but league sources are telling Stein there have been scenarios discussed in which Quentin Grimes would land in Dallas. The 24-year-old who is from Houston, went to Houston and played for the Cougars, is a guy that potentially could be coming back in terms of a trade for Tim Hardaway Jr. Your thoughts initially on that idea when it comes to Tim Hardaway Jr., Quentin Grimes, and the news that Mark Stein's putting out there with respect to that?
My first thought is just like I want to understand why that's the case. You know what I mean? Like why or what brings you to that place for the Pistons, right? And I guess, look, obviously we understand what it is for the Mavericks.
Did I just lose? I might have just lost audio there.
Oh, you're back. Yeah, you good.
Okay, cool. Yeah, when it comes down to it for the Mavericks, it's like, look, getting off of Tim Hardaway Jr. is the case. But when you're, at least when I think about it, when you're doing the situation of you know, sending an expiring contract out, you're either doing someone a favor or someone's doing you a favor, right?
Yeah.
You're doing someone a favor on the idea of, hey, I will take this contract that you have that is longer, and here you can have this expiring contract that'll go away. Or I am going to give you this expiring contract and you can hold on to that for me, and here's a little something for your troubles. That potential trade for Quentin Grimes doesn't really fit into either of those. And so I do wonder, like, yo, what would be the incentive for the Pistons? I think we all kind of look at Tim Hardaway Jr. as, you know, obviously he's a vet. He is ostensibly a shooter and those things, but he has his limitations, and the Pistons aren't trying to do nothing. And so I don't know, like, that they have appeal for him as the player. We're talking about the contract. So I'm like, what would then, like, what would make them get to that point where they're like, yeah, we'll take this, we'll give you Quentin Grimes and end of deal, right? Without necessarily getting some draft compensation, as that's a team that's trying to rebuild in that situation. Draft compensation would be something that they want, or without giving them like a young player that's talented that would then lead them to something and help them build, right? Like, you're just saying, hey, Quentin Grimes, Tim Hardaway Jr., that's it. I don't fully understand like what the Pistons would be getting in the get back there.
Yeah, Grimes, 24 years old, as we mentioned, a native of Houston, you know, not a guy that you would think, you know, in terms of, by the way, Stephen A. probably still thinks that Quentin Grimes is still on that team based off of what he had said a while back, if folks remember that. But look, he's a career 37% shooter from the three-point line on 5 attempts per game, 6'5", 210, good point of attack defender. He's young, but is he basically another version, you know, of Josh Green, someone you kind of already have
for sure
on your team? So this would be more so for the Pistons, a team that, if they made certain moves, could get themselves to a point where they got $66 million in cap space going into the offseason, a team that could definitely absorb a Tim Hardaway type of deal. And what's interesting is Trajan Langdon, who, of course, now runs the show in Detroit, was part of the team in New Orleans that offered Tim Hardaway what was, I believe, a 4-year, near $90 million deal to come to the Pelicans before he eventually came back to Dallas. So Langdon, familiar with Tim Hardaway Jr.'s game, a little bit different situation now, him being 32 years of age, you know, on an expiring deal, but nonetheless, there's familiarity there. And also the tidbit that Dennis Lindsey has been hired as the senior vice president of basketball operations in Detroit. Now, Lindsey, of course, was a senior advisor to Nico Harrison and the Mavericks during this season, and now he and Langdon will be charged with being able to turn around the Pistons, which is interesting because Lindsey was a finalist for the job that Langdon actually got, and now Langdon hires him to be part of his team. So a really good front office that Langdon is building, you know, there in Detroit. But the wrinkle being that there's some connectivity and familiarity there in terms of, obviously, Lindsey now going to Detroit, but also Langdon having familiarity with Tim Hardaway. But also Sean Sweeney is going to be interviewing, or has already interviewed, for that job in Detroit as well, to be potentially their next head coach. So a lot of Dallas-Detroit connection that is being happening here. But for Tim Hardaway, look, the overall arching point here is Tim Hardaway, it doesn't feel like it's going to be on this roster by the time we get to the end of free agency, and certainly not by the time, obviously, that we get to training camp. It feels like the Mavericks are determined to go ahead and move off of him, as potentially to, you know, allow guys like Jaden Hardy and others to start to be able to flourish within this team. It feels like it's becoming much more certain, and maybe as soon as what happens over the next couple of days in terms of the NBA draft, that Tim Hardaway Jr. doesn't appear is going to be on this team for very much longer here.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Like the NBA draft is one of those mile markers during the course of an NBA season where transactions can happen and, will happen. Right. And yeah, man, we've known honestly, for years at this point that this organization would prefer to have moved Tim Hardaway Jr. And now it's very evident that this is the most palatable that he and his contract have been around the league. And so that parting of ways feels like it has to happen, and it will happen. I mean, we've heard people on the record, off the record, kind of all point to that direction. When it comes to Quentin Grimes, like, sure. I mean, again, I don't feel awful about the idea of redundancy. In theory, I think a lot of times we look at redundancy as like a negative, like, hey, you already have that and thus you don't need another one. But sometimes redundancy can be good, because if one fails in some ways, and I don't necessarily mean that, you have another thing that gives you something similar. And at the very least, what it would give you is a rotation player that has an opportunity to come in and give you, like, well, one comes with a fresh start and doesn't come with the baggage that you had previously had. And just like a rotation player that maybe can add in, that maybe can fit with what Jason Kidd is doing. And most importantly, a little bit of cap relief, because that's the thing when it comes to Tim Hardaway Jr. You just need to get that number down. And Quentin Grimes sitting on that $4 and change million contract, at least for the 24-25 season, that matters. That definitely matters. So yeah, no, that connectivity with Detroit is interesting, because maybe that smooths over the way that this goes. And maybe it's just like an aligning of perspectives on making that particular deal happen, and who knows, deals in the future. But at the very least, like, I'm with it, right? Like, I don't think it's objectionable, right? Like, I don't know that necessarily you're looking at Quentin Grimes is coming in and making a change to what you're talking about, right? And you mentioned the exit interviews for Nico Harrison. He talked about, like, the top 7 or 8 on their team remaining the same. Quentin Grimes isn't a guy that you're talking about in that group of guys. So I don't think it's going to matter a ton, but what it will matter with is that $12 million that you can save on your cap sheet by making that particular move. So it's in some ways not a big deal, but in other ways it's a very big deal, if that makes sense.
Especially if you get Grimes and you're able to use Josh Green potentially to move him in another deal that you're trying to potentially make.
That is true.
That where Grimes could fill in and have a little bit larger role if you decide to move on from Josh Green. It's interesting you brought up the Derrick Jones Jr. point of all this too, with Nico Harrison, who had mentioned during his, exit interview and end of the year press conference that, that Derrick Jones Jr. is both 1A, 1B in terms of priority to keep for this team. Now, Jake Fisher reporting for Yahoo Sports, detailing the similar information when it comes to Tim Hardaway Jr. and the fact that the Mavericks are trying to move him. Again, the attractive part being that he has the expiring contract. Fisher adds on to it saying that, look, if the Mavericks are not able to retain the services of a Derrick Jones Jr., who could be looking somewhere, based off of what we're kind of understanding in terms of the Mavericks having that $5.1, $5.2 million mid-level exception that they have, it's going to take a little bit more than that in order to keep Derrick Jones Jr. We're talking about potentially in the $10 to $12 million range that he could be, looking for.
Or maybe even the full non-taxpayer mid, right? Like the full non-taxpayer mid is right around 13, I believe.
So the Mavericks will still have to make some things shake in order to get to that number, in order to get him, back into the fold. But if the Mavericks are unable to retain the services of Derrick Jones, Fisher reports that the Mavericks could be interested in a Naji Marshall from the Pelicans. Marshall 6'7", got a 7-foot wingspan, 26 years of age, just finished his 4th season with the Pelicans. The athletic defender, shot the ball in terms of 38% from the three-point line, but not on volume necessarily, only about 2.5 attempts per game, but did have a pretty nice postseason, even in the 4 games that the Pelicans, got swept in, of course, against the Oklahoma City Thunder. But Naji Marshall could be a guy who was a former undrafted player, former 2A guy that's really carved out a nice little space for him.
Who does that sound like?
Dorian Finney-Smith.
That sounds a lot like Derrick Jones Jr., former
Derrick Jones Jr. Oh,
right?
Yeah.
You're absolutely in that space, and he is an interesting player in that way. Plus, all of the things that we talked about, I feel like I'm a year away, or like I'm going back a year in the past, because myself and you had a conversation that I was actually listening back to recently. The idea of, hey, Derrick Jones Jr., like the 3-point shooting isn't at a big number, but when you look at corner threes and you look at those numbers, like, and then you add that Luka bump of the ways that he's going to create, that takes it up to a different level. And Naji Marshall is interesting in that perspective. But I think that there's something about that continuity that you can have, knowing exactly what the role is and not necessarily having to project it, that Derrick Jones Jr. is super appealing, plus the athleticism, right? We talk about the vertical aspect of the game that was added with Lively and Gafford. Derrick Jones Jr. is one of those guys, too. They utilized him with the pick. We saw them in the finals where it was like, hey, that 1-5 pick and roll isn't necessarily happening. How about this 1-3 pick and roll with Derrick Jones Jr., where he's now rolling and throwing it up to him for a slam? Those are things that I don't know that you can necessarily replicate in that way. And I think that there's a level of comfort. So if you can get that done, that matters. And that's why if you go back, right, the $12 million, whatever that you could create in a potential Tim Hardaway Jr., Quentin Grimes deal matters, because you're $1.8 million over the luxury tax threshold. And look, my head is hurting because I've spent the last 2 hours trying to figure out what's happening with the CBA. I'm literally 0% smarter for my efforts. But like, if you have any small inkling of what's happening there, you know that the new CBA has some real wild workings that make it tough to make some things shake, and being under some of these thresholds would help a good amount. So that leeway, that room would help greatly in facilitating a Derrick Jones Jr.'s deal, or even a Naji Marshall deal if someone comes and throws a bag in front of Derrick Jones Jr., lures him away. So, yeah, all these things kind of tie together. It's another offseason where Nico Harrison has a relatively thin landing strip to land on, right? There's a needle to thread, maybe not exactly in the same way as last offseason where he had to make sure to get a number 10 pick and then turn that number 10 pick into a 12 and a 20-some, wherever you got Omax, right? Like, and flip and flip and flip. Maybe you're not exactly. And then he did that again at the trade deadline, I just realized, because he went to the Bank of Presti and flipped and flipped and flipped. Sure did. Right? And so maybe it's not exactly the same level of flip, but there's some flipping that needs to be done. And so Nico Harrison has a level of experience, but here he goes, level 3 or 4 at this point, because it feels like at every juncture that since he's been here, he's had to do some level of flip. KP, Kyrie, Lively, Gafford, PJ Watt, like there's some level of threading the needle to have to be done. And you're in another circumstance.
To his credit, he's done it.
Yeah.
So I think if you're a Mavericks fan, listening to this and seeing kind of the things that are happening here, thinking, what could happen between now and by the time we get to the end of the NBA draft, Nico Harrison has shown a willingness and a capability to be able, as you mentioned, to flip a lot of different kinds of assets to be able to get the kinds of players that have obviously helped this team make it to the NBA Finals. How much more of that gymnastics is he going to have to do, given the fact that what we look at in terms of their draft capital and the limited financial resources that they have, he's going to have to turn a lot of that into some different things, because the Naji Marshall thing, that's an interesting thing because, again, as you mentioned, it kind of reminds you of the idea of how they were able to get, Derrick Jones Jr. in terms of a, veteran minimum signing, and he be able to turn into the kind of player that he did for the Mavericks this past year. But it also gets me to this, because Bleacher Report puts out a very interesting trade scenario that I kind of wanted to go over with you, because, when you look at how the NBA and the salary cap and the way that things are structured now, it makes it a lot more difficult for these teams to be able to keep together expensive rosters, and your ability to be able to develop young talent and to be able to have cheap talent and be successful. It feels like in a lot of ways that's the way this is going to go. Hell, even the Lakers were even talking about it when they hired JJ Redick, Rob Pelinka talking about, look, we've got to find creative ways to be able to build a program that has centered around player development, because it's much more prohibitive now to be able to have the kinds of rosters that you have traditionally in the past where you could keep a bunch of expensive players. Which brings me to this, because Bleacher Report puts out this mock trade idea, and it has to do with the Portland Trail Blazers. Now, whether you feel like, a Malcolm Brogdon or someone else may be a little more feasible, that's another conversation for another day. But the trade idea is that the Mavericks would get Jerami Grant, okay? And the Portland Trail Blazers would receive Tim Hardaway Jr., Maxi Kleber, their 2025 first-round pick, and their 2031 first-round pick in order to facilitate that kind of deal. Now, what's interesting is Jake Fisher, we talked a little bit earlier in terms of the Derrick Jones Jr. information with Naji Marshall potentially being a fit if the Mavericks aren't able to retain him. There's reporting by Fisher that the Lakers could be in play for Jerami Grant by giving up their 17th pick of this year's draft in order to try and facilitate something with Portland. Again, you would be absorbing a contract where Grant is owed over $30 million plus for the next,
that's a 4+1. No, that's a 4+1. He's still got 5 years, I believe, or is it 4 years? It's a 3+1.
Yeah, because
it was a 5-year deal. He's run 1 year out. He has an option on the last year, so it's a 3+1. And that's why, if you're watching the video copy of this, you might have seen me kind of wince a little bit that you put 2 first-round picks in this, and it's tough because
steep.
I am still viewing this in some ways like that's not a good contract necessarily for what he is. Right. Let's be honest.
What's interesting about that is the salary cap is going to continue to go up.
Yes,
that's
it is.
One thing that, if you're looking at the amount of money, because by the time you get to the end of that deal, I believe it's around $36 million he's owed in the final year of that deal. The salary cap is going to continue to go up, especially with the new television deal, whenever that's officially, signed and ratified and, in place. So that contract will look a little bit different in light of the salary cap continuing to increase versus what it does now. That if you're thinking about it a little bit more forward in the future, they say, okay, maybe that's something you can absorb a little bit more based off of the fact that you'll have more room in the salary cap.
Yes, and I think that's a good note, and thank you for adding to that, because I think that's from a perspective of viability. It's definitely viable. I'm talking about like when we're talking about a value proposition to the player's capabilities, right?
Yeah.
If we're talking about money as a proxy for evaluation of player, that contract does not fit with what we have with Jerami Grant here. I almost called him his brother or brother, I believe. Yes. And so, but like, I'm not saying that to say that he is bad, right? But hey, man, the Blazers have a lot of money tied up, right? Like getting off of Jerami Grant is not simply, hey, this is an asset that we can send somewhere. This is cap relief in some ways. And so like, it's tough because there's another team rumored in, as you mentioned, the Lakers, that are looking for him as like a talent acquisition. And so they can play it as such. But like, I view that the potential of a Mavs Portland trade in this way as like kind of cap balancing. And if you take Tim Hardaway Jr. expiring, Maxi Kleber expiring in another 2 years, or like, 2 years remaining, right? To get off of a 3+1 on a player who is not necessarily providing you the same value as his contract is worth. Hey, man, I feel like we could wipe our hands and be done with this. Or if you want to add a little extra, I could throw you a second in here, and maybe I'm driving too hard of a bargain, right? But if we talk about 1 first, all right, I'm a little uneasy. 2 first, what are we talking about, right? Especially when not just 2 first, they're 2 first in a context of where the other first at, because those 2 firsts are getting mighty lonely, right? Like you don't have. You're not apparently the New York Knicks, but you're not the Oklahoma City Thunder, right? You don't have a war chest of picks, right? So I think you have to be judicious with them. And I don't know, that doesn't feel like it'd be being judicious with them. Now, addressing the player himself, I think it's an interesting fit, right? Like offensively, he is a shooter. He can get a shot a little bit, which you needed kind of a third guy who can get his shot a little bit. Defensively, he has I think he has the capabilities and the framework that put in the context that the Mavericks and Jason Kidd seemingly have done. They've drawn the best defensively out of all the guys that they've had in the system, maybe save one. Hello, Christian Wood, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, I like that. The tough thing about it is, like, he has not played a lot of winning basketball, and I do wonder what the organization views of him in that context, right? And like if he fits into the kind of the characteristics of the team, right? The morale of the team, because that was a question that we have for PJ Washington. But PJ Washington, like, you could assuage some of that, like super hard worker, like all those things, and he came in and he ended up fitting in, right? What happens if that doesn't work, especially because it's a 3+1 and then you're in that place where you have a lot of your cap space tied up. If this trade is gone in the way that it does, you would have used even more of your very limited assets, and there's not really a lot of opportunity to then fix that per se. Like the 2 first really make me super queasy, right? If you're talking about this with the particular players and then maybe limited draft capital assets, you can talk me into it a lot easier. I don't like that as it's situated.
Yeah, a couple of things, because the Mavericks already don't have control of their first round picks between the years 2027 and 2030. Like, we're talking about the top 2 protected first that they owe Charlotte in 2027. Brooklyn, well, they owe that pick in the first round in 2029, but now that pick now belongs to Houston. So that just shows you how quickly things can change. That 2029 unprotected pick that was going to Brooklyn, now Houston owns, and now they have a chance based on contingencies to pick which one that they want between Dallas and Phoenix. But that's another conversation for another day. But the idea being here is, I think Grant's getting a little bit of a bad rap because he decided, because the way that he was playing in Denver, for example, really good defensive player, offensively, you could see some flashes there, but he decided to go get the payday from Portland, where he's going to get many more shots and still be kind of one of the primary offensive players there.
Well, I think Detroit first before he ended up in Portland, right?
Yeah, well, he eventually took the payday to go and get, and got it from the Portland Trailblazers. And I think for him, he at 30 years of age, I think if he came to a situation in Dallas, it would feel a lot of ways like he would be able to he would have the chance to win with a really good team. And I think he would be able to fit in just fine here. Like, this is a guy who really started to open up people's eyes when he was with Team USA and really was a big part of what they were able to do in terms of winning what was the gold medal. And what was that, 2000, I guess technically 2021 for the Tokyo 2020 games. But the point being, like, he fit in well there. I think he would be fine here in Dallas, but that is a steep price to pay. Again, as we mentioned, with the idea that you have to be able to develop young talent and find young, cheap talent in order to build your roster, because of how much more difficult it is to maintain and build your rosters now, that giving up your 2025 and your 2031, the 25, okay, I might be willing to go ahead and move, especially for the window of when now that you're in. The 2025 one, okay.
Especially, that's not as likely to be a high pick, right? Like, in fact, it feels super impossible that that's going to be a high pick.
Exactly. Now, the 2031 one, okay, now hold on. We might have to pump the brakes on that. But, yeah, if it means just I move on for Tim Hardaway and Maxi Kleber, if I have to throw in someone else, maybe it's a Josh Green or someone else to be able to make that shake, and the 2025 first-round pick, yeah, I would probably do that, even with him being at 30 years of age, because I think him as a player going to the environment, the strong culture that the Mavericks have built here, I think he would be able to be absorbed into that fairly well and to play alongside Luka and Kyrie to be able to fit here in Dallas in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I do like the player. I do think that he provides, at least in theory, most of the things that you were looking for as we're looking through that NBA Finals. We're like, oh, you still need another guy that you feel dependable to go to as a third scorer. You would love to have another guy that can kind of create his own, especially if you find the context of, hey, the Oklahoma City Thunder are going to be a team that matters in the West. And they demonstrated that they have a couple of dudes that they can defend and take your two-headed monster of creators and make their lives difficult, right? And so if you have a third person that goes, oh, okay, you've tried to take these two cards off the table, well, here's this extra one that we have up our sleeve. Like, it makes it a lot better. And you're in a place now after going to the finals where now you start building your team not just to be generally good, but to face off against the teams that are around you. I think that could be super helpful, in addition to adding another defender in the context of your starting lineup, especially if Derrick Jones Jr. is not going to remain. Like, if that's a possibility, and even if he does remain, now you have a little bit of wealth of those types of things. I like what the player provides. It just has to come at the right price. Like, that's the tough thing that you're now threading the needle on because of past asset drip, right? You've lost assets in certain places, and you've had to use assets to kind of cover over and paper over or fix some other issues that have happened. And so now you're in a place where you can't really afford to overpay a little bit, like, or at least I don't feel like you can. Like, maybe Nico Harrison, who probably is a lot better at assessing those risks, right, and the ROI on all of these things, right, having been an executive with Nike and now with the Mavericks done this for a few years, he's definitely going to be better at this. But that feels like something where you don't have a lot of opportunity or a lot of leeway to overpay for that circumstance, at least not from my perspective.
No, I agree. Like, it had to be a really calculated risk to be able to make that move, because in a lot of ways, that's the team that you got for a little bit.
It'd be pretty final, pretty damn final.
If you make that move for Jerami Grant, that's kind of the roster that you got for a while to be able to try and work with to get to a championship. And that's not to even mention the ideas of Luka Doncic getting his massive contract extension at the end of this upcoming season.
Yeah.
Conversations potentially about a Kyrie Irving extension that you're going to have to start really thinking about as well. Like, there are other financial ramifications that if you decide to trade for a player like Jerami Grant, that's really going to come up by the time you get to the end of next season and thinking about what you may have to do. And then, honestly, you start thinking about if Daniel Gafford and PJ Washington continue to make the growth and the leaps that we think, especially we've heard reported, from Brian Damaris with, the Take That With You podcast that, they're retooling PJ Washington's 3-point shot extensively. So where by the time we get to this upcoming season, we may see a completely brand new 3-point shot from PJ Washington. If he, let's say for conversation's sake, that he gets there too, you're talking about another player that could be in line to be able to have a nice little payday himself in terms of an extension if he continues to show that growth. Like, there's a lot of things that are starting to come into play here based off of what this team is and what they have from a asset management standpoint that could really make things interesting. But that is what this time of the year is interesting when it comes to all of this. Shout out to Woj for dropping some bombs to make it even that much more interesting. Before we end today, anything that you want to see when it comes to this Mavericks team from a trade standpoint, a free agency standpoint, or just any general thoughts on what we have seen over the first, I guess, couple of days leading up to the draft when it comes to all this here?
Well, I don't know. I don't know that there's, I would like to see some level of, well, first of all, obviously, make sure the Tim thing actually happens this time, right? I feel like we've all settled in on the idea that it will happen. However, I feel like I've been in this place before, right? And again, I think that this is the circumstance that lends itself most to it happening. And I don't say this because Tim Hardaway Jr. is some kind of bad guy. However, hey, make sure that thing happens for real this time, right? Like, for real, see it out, my boy, right? I need this to actually happen this time. I think I wouldn't be super sad if it's just bring Tim Hardaway Jr. back, run it back, right? Like, I think that this is a well-built team when it comes to the cohesion that they seem to have. But I don't even know if there's something in particular that I'm looking forward to. I have a lot of trust in Nico Harrison, man. We talked about the ways in which at every given juncture he's gone and tried to make a swing, and should the swing not work or should the swing not fit, which I think is really only one when you talk about Grant Williams, immediately that gets fixed up and it gets put into a place where it is better, right? So I kind of trust him, and you should trust him with the evaluation and identifying what the issue is and putting the right one in there, because that's why you went and got this particular dude, right? He was a executive in Nike, and doing that, he had to be able to identify talent, and it seems like he's been very good at that in the early stages of his tenure here. And so, like, I trust him to make the right moves, whether it's limited moves or being fairly aggressive. So from that perspective, I trust him. And then also, like, I think he's done a great job of working with people that are workable, right? I talked about Danny Ainge, but like, Danny Ainge drives a hard bargain. He did in Boston. He does with Utah now, right? And I feel like if you look back at the people that Nico Harrison has worked with, the general managers, I think that he's selected the right general manager to work with to get things done that are not necessarily going to drive the most difficult bargains per se. And so I don't know. I've built a lot of trust with this dude. And maybe he would look at that Jerami Grant trade and say, actually, that's the right number. Especially when you seeing out here that Mikal Bridges will draw 5 firsts. Maybe I just don't know what it is, right? Maybe I'm like, yeah, Jerami Grant does draw 1 or 2 firsts. No idea. No earthly idea from over here, to be completely honest.
Woo! The idea that in the last couple of years, Mikal Bridges have gotten 5 first-round picks. If I remember,
Rudy Gobert had 4 as well.
Rudy Gobert was 4 first-round picks that he got.
4.
And yeah, the entire now haul of the. I think it was
4. Was it 3? Am I bugging?
I want to say it was 6, but that
was with swaps, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think the total haul was like 6, if I remember correctly, with the swaps and everything else. It was an insane number. It was more than what Kevin Durant got, obviously, when he went to Phoenix, and obviously what we're seeing with the whole Mikal Bridges trade. But
yeah, it was 4 firsts and a swap for Rudy Gobert. The Mikal Bridges is 5 firsts and a swap and some seconds, I think, in there as well. Right? Like, we are just in an insane place when it comes to trades. My bad to the CBA, because I was like, yo, the CBA is going to make it so that it's so much more difficult to make things happen. And they were like, oh, really? For real? You sure?
Well, look, the way that I'm going to end this today is the Mavericks go find a way to go get OG Anunoby. I don't know how you do it. Make it happen somehow.
And when he says he doesn't know, he really doesn't. We spent the first 15 minutes before.
I have no idea. No idea how that's going to happen.
Be smarter than us, please.
Please figure it out. That would be awesome if somehow you got OG Anunoby. That would be crazy, by the way. Luka, Kyrie, OG Anunoby as your top 3 guys. That would be.
And then PJ and Lively. That rounds out your 5.
Woo! I could work with that.
That's tough.
That's tough. That is tough. Imagine we got just PJ and OG by themselves locking folks down, and then you got Luke and Kyrie doing their thing on the offensive end. And whether or not you want to insert, this will be another conversation for another day. Is it time to insert Derek Lively as your full-time starter at center and have Daniel Gafford coming off the bench? We'll have to talk about that sometime down the road. But if you wanted to have Lively in your starting lineup, a Luka, Kyrie, OG, PJ, Lively starting lineup, yeah.
The word that came to mind is dynamic.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. Well, that'll end today's show. Reg, tell the folks where they can find you at, man.
At Reg Adetula on Twitter. And yeah, that's sometimes I be on Locked On Mavs. Check out my man Nick Angstad, always giving you great content alongside the Inside the Mavs podcast with my guy Kevin Gray.
Yeah, definitely check out his latest episode with Nick. He had a good friend of ours, Lauren Gunn, on the podcast for him. Locked On Mavs. Yeah, I know. Right, I know. Well, I was excited to see.
I've been slacking on my pimping. I will go do that.
Yeah, for sure. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin Gray Sports. Of course, your Mavericks Pre and Post Game host on the Dallas Mavericks Radio Network. If you're watching this on my YouTube channel at Kevin Gray Sports, make sure you like and comment on the video. Let me know what you want to see in terms of the Mavericks. Any thoughts about what we've seen already in terms of the wild trade that we've seen in the NBA and more. But drop that in the comments as well. And download and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast for free. That'll do it for this episode of Inside the Mavs. Thanks to Reg Adetula for joining me here on this episode of Inside the Mavs, presented by Aura.